Welcome to the IT Matters Podcast, where we explore why IT matters and matters pertaining to IT. Here's your host, Aaron Bock.
Welcome again to the IT Matters Podcast. As you heard, I'm your host, Aaron Bock, and super excited about this episode today. I hope you guys have been doing well. We are talking to Will Friedrich, who is the Director of Strategy and Consulting at Experis. Will is here in Charlotte, and I'm going to let him introduce himself here in a second, but today's going to be a really interesting conversation. We've been talking a lot about general IT trends. We're going to get a little bit deeper today in where Will specializes, which is cloud FinOps. And FinOps, what is that? How does it affect us? Very excited about this episode today because I think a lot of you out there, whether you're in IT or in a finance or other function, know about the cloud, have heard about the cloud. There's a lot that we do know and there's a lot we don't know. And I think that what Will does is it's a great general practice that we all need to be aware of. So before we get too deep, Will, I will turn it over to you. Thanks for joining the show. Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for having me. Yeah. So again, I'm Will Friedrich. I'm, like you mentioned, Director of Strategy and Consulting for Experis. Experis is a IT staffing and consulting services and solutions provider, part of the Manpower brand. I was previously with Attain Group, and we were recently acquired by Manpower and integrated with Experis. So it's been a whirlwind last few months with integration and extremely busy. And yeah, 17-year career for me thus far in technology. I've had various roles within PMO functions, product leadership, a lot of software delivery, which curtailed into agile delivery and DevOps, those types of things. Spent some time in IT services and infrastructure leadership and cloud, and some TBM consulting. So on the personal side, husband, proud father of two terrific kids, and love to surf, play golf, very sports, all of that, and love college football. So college football Saturdays are around the corner, and can't wait for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Before the show, Will was telling me, because I knew he was a Georgia fan, so I assumed the whole family was, but it sounds like there's a little bit of conflict in the household.
Yeah, half the family. So my side, Georgia Bulldogs. I went to college in Charleston, so no football. We're still undefeated. My wife's they're Buckeyes, so take it or leave it. And my son, he inexplicably found Clemson on his own. I think as he was coming into football, they won the national championship in 2018. Trevor Lawrence, Tigers, Dabo, the energy, the orange. I think he just gravitated towards it. So he's a Clemson fan. He's the black sheep in the college football dynamic.
Yeah, maybe they'll all be in one conference in
That's
a year
right.
or two. You never know. Well, thank you for joining. And I guess before we get started, because you just mentioned about 4 acronyms that I think maybe some listeners might not know. So you said TBM. Can you just define TBM for the listeners just so they get a little bit more of your background?
Sure. So that's technology business management, which is a larger governing model for IT and business structure organizations that are focused on their IT operations. Cloud FinOps, it becomes part of that as companies begin to adopt the cloud more and more. PMO, what was another one, project and program management office. So in a lot of instances, and in my experience, it's been helping to lead a shared service across an enterprise where we help to manage and run various technology projects from IT operations, system support, upgrades, app dev, all of those types of things.
Great. So let's go. You said you've had a 17-year career in IT or around IT. And now cloud FinOps is kind of a specialty, but cloud has not really been around for 17 years in the mass media or in mass companies. So when did you start dealing with the cloud, working with the cloud, become interested in the cloud? How did it start? Just give a little more details there.
Sure. For me, personally, in my career, it started around 2015, 2016. I was working for an IT integrator based in Charlotte, and our data center practice and our security practice started to get into Cisco's software-defined networking offering, which was cloud-based, and they were starting to acquire different private cloud platforms to help enable that kind of technology. And the The FinOps piece came much later. I mean, as a cost management discipline for the cloud, it's really, I would say, three years old in terms of a real concentrated focus. Cloud providers services have been around, in the case of Amazon, AWS, as early as 2006, but then focusing on the cost impact of that as a discipline, 2018, 2019, around that time frame. So there's roughly a 12-year gap between when the capabilities were available, migrations really started to move in that direction. And then, a decade later, people are starting to realize that there is a need to focus on the cost impact.
What is the reason, you think, for the 12-year gap before people started becoming interested in FinOps and really cost optimization of the cloud?
Yeah, I think from the providers, taking the big three, for example, across AWS and Azure, GCP, within their platforms, they've had cost management tools to various degrees. Whether it's Cost Explorer for AWS, the cost manager piece, the cost management portal for Azure. And so, but that's kind of been in a vacuum. What the Cloud FinOps discipline and through the FinOps Foundation is attempting to do is say there's a much more intentional and consistent orchestration of different stakeholders across an organization that should be paying attention to this, as opposed to engineers pushing a button and making a purchase in a vacuum, and as opposed to the finance and back office function looking at their reporting in a vacuum. And if these two groups aren't talking, you're still going to get surprised when you have over provisioning that leads to cost overruns, you overcommit, your vacancy's too high, all those types of things. So I really think that this emergence of different stakeholder groups that traditionally don't interact with each other now need to come together to keep this working consistently and to mature this focus is really important. And two of those stakeholder groups are, you couldn't be further apart in terms of where traditional IT was with a central procurement group and those types of things to where it is now, highly distributed, meaning the finance and back office team now working with engineering and now working with IT ops. And so I think, back to your question about why did it take so long, I think it's because it's this recognition of there are groups of people that within a corporate culture need to come together and start working together in a different way. It's not as simple as just having, a basic cost management capability inside of the tool.
Well, and then I guess, what we see with our customers is that we've got, if you look at the bell curve of technology, you've got customers who are cutting edge, they're way ahead, they were born in the cloud, they're already on all the, cloud services native, et cetera. And then you've got the traditional, we're in the Southeast where there's a lot of manufacturing, traditional folks that haven't really even kind of said yes to the cloud yet. So I think my prediction is probably part of that reason is that you still don't have a 100% adoption on the cloud. If we're getting closer to more people accepting it fully. But my question for you would be, let's go back to before we get into really deep into cloud FinOps and the collaboration between departments. I think we hear a lot, from like a CFO or a CEO, like why change? Why go to the cloud? What are the benefits? So maybe speak to that, for those folks that are listening that are not on the cloud or very little on the cloud, like why should they even consider it? Why are all these big companies and why is there so much emphasis on going to the cloud?
Yeah, I think the emphasis for going to the cloud has been this momentum of the architectures of software have changed dramatically over the last several years. And so in terms of companies undertaking a digital first strategy, you hear about digital transformation, those types of buzzwords. The underlying principle of software development in that pursuit is service-oriented architecture, right? Highly distributed. And even you could go so far as to say, the microservices and being able to develop with those that type of architecture. To support that, you need a highly distributed architecture as code or architecture as a service to facilitate that. So your compute, your storage, your networking resources have to adapt to that type of application. And so I think that's one of the main reasons for moving to the cloud. The other is the performance that the cloud providers can provide scales infinitely faster than you can purchase new gear, refresh your hardware. And you're seeing the impacts of companies believing that notion. The annual growth rate for for cloud consumption. And it's really, when I say cloud consumption, I'm talking about infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. There's various product segments, but those two main ones kind of driving things at the top. It's growing at a 14-15% annual growth rate clip, and that number alone doesn't really mean much. But when you put it in context and you compare it to an annual growth rate with traditional IT gear, that's growing at about 1.3%. So, and at some point, and some suggest, there was an article in I think ZDNet through the IDC research, they took out an article that said, for the first time ever, the forecasted spend for cloud services, shared services is going to eclipse traditional IT for the first time in real dollars. So you're starting to see.
Do you think that was sped up because of COVID, or do you think that was happening already and COVID just is a coincidence that people became more distributed?
Well, it was happening before. COVID certainly had an impact, but it was more than just COVID. At the time, there was, you can imagine a lot of the cloud providers, their sales forces, their reseller channels, their partner groups really began to push cloud services, which is good because the performance, it is in some respects a better performing IT infrastructure than what you're using on-prem, provided that your use cases align with what you need it for. Well, these groups began to really push that. And so companies got caught up in it. And the way that you provision cloud services is completely different than the way that you do it on-prem. And a lot of companies got caught up in the just like for like matching. Whatever we're doing on-prem, let's replicate that in the cloud. We're simply just going to lift and shift it. And they over-provisioned. And then on top of that, they started looking at all the discounts they could achieve if they commit to certain resources in advance, commit to certain terms. And so then they overcommit. So now you're burning the candle at both ends. You don't have the right architecture in the cloud. You're overpaying for your prepaid service. You're not using it the way that you purchased it. And so now you have a mismatch, and then they get their cloud bills and they're huge and they don't know why. And in a lot of cases, they don't know where the spend's coming from. So I think that's the cloud adoption is really accelerated, but there was kind of this synthetic business driver that got people kind of backwards. And now, you read about CIOs doing the unthinkable. They're moving back. They're taking things back out and building, on-prem data centers and investing more in that because they either migrated inappropriately, did it too soon, too fast, too much, and they didn't really give themselves the right ROI window based on the level of their investment. So they invested, and the level of investment probably needed a 5 to 7 year ROI window, and they've got a 2-year horizon. And right. Now there's a match, and they're moving back.
So let's come back to that because we've seen some of it, and I'm interested to hear your perspective. Let's go back to maybe it's the CFO or the CEO who goes to a conference or hears this or is hearing it from others. You need to be considering the cloud. You said something just there that's really important. If you have the right use cases. So like if you're talking to that CFO who's not sure because they're not as intimate with IT as, an IT director, CIO, or someone like that, what are the general use cases for cloud at this point? And then I would ask you, like, what advice would you give them to start like figuring out, well, how do we go to the cloud? Is it 100%? Like what percentage is the right percentage for us?
Yeah, I think the big thing is how much of your business is being driven by a technology experience that needs to be readily available. So you're talking about these hyper use cases for service oriented infrastructure. It's a lot of custom and mobile application development. And how much do you need that performance to be at its peak? That doesn't mean peak usage and you're maximizing the CPU that you're trying to drive, but it's how much of your business is really, innovation through software. I think those make easier candidates to justify migrating because you're going to have a hard time supporting that software innovation and supporting your application development teams long term if you're limiting them with just what you've been able to purchase in a 1 or 3 year cycle in an on-prem data center.
Can you give an example? Like it could be any company in the world, probably one that people have heard of. Like what would be an example of someone who's innovating through software in your eyes? Like how are they doing that? Like just so that our listeners, if they're not as exposed to this concept, they understand it.
Yeah, I think SaaS companies make really good. That software as a service companies make good candidates for this. They're not the only ones. I mean, huge enterprises that are in all kinds of industry segments are moving to the cloud, and rightfully so. They're moving all their production workloads, their websites, all their traffic to the cloud. But the example I always use is it's the Netflix model, but it's not relegated to just companies like Netflix anymore. Almost every company that we deal with is building software and enabling technology inside of their four walls, just like Netflix would. They're building services, they're building software themselves, and they're investing in their application development, as opposed to simply just outsourcing it and said, oh, well, that company developed our website, they built this app, we don't really know, we don't really own the code and that sort of thing. So I think Netflix is a great example. It's that software as a service, and the underlying infrastructure that supports that is coming from the cloud.
I think that's a really good example. And I think if I remember, and I can't cite the source, but Netflix was one of the largest cloud spends in like one of the last couple of years. I forget which cloud they're in, but their cloud spend was enormous, but they could show an ROI because of all of the other factors that they don't have to deal with traditional infrastructure. As we look forward on this podcast, we talk a lot about trends. We talk a lot about what's happening. So I would say the cloud has been a trend for, I don't know, probably since 2015 or before that. You keep hearing about it. You go to Gartner, seminars, you go to different things, and everyone's cloud. 2022, I would say when we hear the cloud, you think of hyperscalers. Like, define the cloud. Like, what is it? Is it just the hyperscalers? Is it you're putting infrastructure as a service and a local colo that's offering it? Like, what is cloud in your eyes, and what the way a CFO or CIO should look at it?
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things about the cloud now is that there are thousands of service SKUs available across different providers to do different things. But by and large, if you're talking about infrastructure as a service, you're talking about compute, storage, and networking. And then platform as a service, you're talking about resources that are packaged together, either for you've got security monitoring, you've got telemetry monitoring, you've got certainly containers, right? So you're deploying containers and positioning your service-oriented applications through containers. And that's a performance, scalable, being able to have a highly distributed model, to have software distributed in that fashion. So you have all those components, and you have all kinds of purchasing options, pricing models, and alternatives that you're evaluating to figure out, well, given that that's my menu, what's the best way to actually put this into production? Thousands of use cases, all dependent on what you're trying to get out of the application. But that's really where Cloud FinOps can help, because that discipline there's whether it's a central team or distributed segment teams that are working with product groups and helping bridge the gap between finance and engineering, to help them understand that if the engineering team is validating that this is the architecture they're going with and these are the resources they've selected, let's make sure that they've got the right mix, and let's make sure that we're making the right purchases to give them the infrastructure that they need. It's really taking all the capabilities you associated with your on-prem data center and having somebody else provide it. You just have to be much smarter and much more deliberate about how you can consume it, because it's not the water cooler that gets delivered to your office every month. It's a sprinkler system that if you don't turn it off, the bill keeps running. So it's a completely different metered billing model.
That's a great analogy. For I guess for the listeners, let's talk a little bit about specifically like where what you do now for Experis, like when people engage you, like, because I think what I want to do is define Cloud FinOps in the sense of like, what is that for an organization? Is it a department? Is it a role under finance? Is it a role in IT? You do it as a consultant. Like, so when would a customer engage you? And maybe if you can share, you don't have to share names, but share an example or a story about when you've come into a customer and it's a mess, or they very much need what you do. Explain that for our listeners. Yeah,
sure. So a couple of things. One, just in terms of the term Cloud FinOps. So the reason why I keep putting cloud in front of that, the organizations that are governing this, they generally don't. They call it FinOps. In practicality, and when working with customers, one of the problems that presents is that FinOps in general refers to a collection of financial operations that a business might undertake. So separate from that general term, FinOps the way that these organizations are using it for the cloud is really a combination of, Fin coming from financial management, and then the ops piece coming from a combination of DevOps and data ops enablement that's used to actually bring financial management best practices for the cloud to life. So there is an engineering discipline within this. But really, when we engage customers, we engage them in this discipline on different levels. From an Experis perspective, we have consulting services in that we can help organizations with maturity assessments, helping them to look at stakeholder interviewing and environment discovery. We can help them with baselining their KPIs and their OKRs and all the metrics that you would use to drive proficiency in trying to get better at managing and even getting to a certain point where you're optimizing cloud spend. And then we help organizations build teams. So the notion of the last couple of years that's come to light is this notion of the FinOps team. So it's kind of like an agile delivery pod, but this group is central. It's usually within the CIO's purview, sometimes reporting up to a kind of a combined function between CIO and CFO. And it works with different stakeholder groups. And they're really the air traffic control function within this organization to make sure that, as you're developing processes and as you're developing workflows, and then as you're applying automation to those processes to get better about reviewing reports, making real-time decisions on cloud spend, and being able to drive certain operations metrics, they're there to make sure that those groups keep the same autonomy, like particularly on the engineering side, that they've worked so hard to achieve through Agile and Kanban, all those types of delivery models. They want to keep that autonomy. They just want to increase the awareness and the impact of what they do. What impact does that have on the business? What impact does that have on what the finance, procurement, and back office groups now have to deal with as a result of what they're doing for resource purchasing? And so it's an orchestration of different groups that all are trying to do the right thing by managing cloud cost. They're just each doing it in a vacuum and not communicating. So it's really a team that facilitates. So when clients come to us, we're really helping them to do just that. In a lot of instances, they're past the point of determining whether or not the cloud is for them. They're in the throes of a migration plan where they need to have a concerted effort at looking at cost management, or they have a lot of applications that are born in the cloud. They're operating post-migration, but there's still that consistent focus on needing to achieve cost management. You have to make sure that these things aren't wildly out of control. I think I saw that cloud as an enterprise level expense in many instances is second only to payroll. So if you're not paying attention to that, it can get wildly out of control. And so there is a need, and there's an associated ROI with investing in a FinOps consulting service, an assessment to help you understand where you are today and where you need to get to. And there's also an ROI for having a team and also staffing full-time dedicated roles that aren't just doing FinOps on the side while they're doing other things, but there's a real push to have dedicated FinOps practitioners in your organization that are doing these types of things as a full-time job. So we help customers in all three of those areas. And one of the examples, to your point, without naming names, although based on where we got them, they probably wouldn't mind name dropping, but I won't. It was a organization that used Azure, and they got caught up in the all too common, well, we just moved. We just shifted because we worked with a vendor. That's what we decided to do. And it was really a decision made in a vacuum that really required a lot of analysis that just didn't happen. Doing it right the first time will save you so much pain later in trying to put out fires on the back end. So they lifted and shifted, and they did some of the things that I alluded to earlier. They just simply replicated from a VM perspective what they had, which they didn't need to. The cloud has gotten much better at giving you more than what you would generally associate the on-prem equivalent. So they had too much, and then they put too many prepaid commitments. So one of the things you can do is that you can get a discount above and beyond an on-demand service rate that a cloud provider might give you for a certain service, let's say a compute instance. And if you commit to that in advance, you can achieve a certain discount. And that's dependent on your ability to make sure that you actually use the commitment for what you purchased it for. And many organizations don't, or they purchase for a 3-year term, and their environment, their usage, their designs, things change. Their infrastructure needs change. And then what happens is they've already purchased the commitment, and now they're back to consuming the on-demand rate once that configuration is a mismatch or they're beyond term. So
we're actually seeing a little tangent, but like what we're seeing like in the infrastructure space and the cloud, one of the softwares or technologies that seems to be popping up more and more as like a trend is the reserved instance and whatever it's called for each cloud, but like the, basically prepaid usage or the reserved instance. We're seeing basically the ability for tech software. You can put a software on there where you can actually sell off instances you might not use that you initially reserved and basically broker those so that you're right sizing. Because to your point, so many customers are struggling with, I don't know how to predict my cloud spend for 3 years. So I'm just going to purchase, whatever they kind of tell me in a calculator in a vacuum, and it's not right.
Right. Yeah. Well, and then those secondary markets are part of it. The other part is you're limited. Certain resources won't let you do that. You can convert some, you can't convert others. You can resize. You can always purchase more. You can't purchase less. Those types of things. So there's different restrictions on what you can and can't do. And one of the things that we worked with this customer on is that a committed savings plan is probably more conducive to their needs than a reservation instance. That's really the most mature version of trying to get a committed purchase to get a discount. Reservations really require you to understand the technical need for something like that. Savings plans and even, Google's got the sustained usage plan. The more you use, the more you save, that type of thing. You can know less about the underlying technical use case for that resource and still feel more confident in doing those types of commitments than you can with a reservation. But, those are some of the nuances that when we start working with customers, they didn't even realize they could do that. Or if they could, where in the tool would I use that? And it's not so much whether or not they made the right commitment or whether or not they're looking at the right report. It's that no one really owned it. So when a condition in their client's environment changes, how do you react to that? If there's a process in place and certain people working on it, they can really handle anything that might come their way.
Do you think the misscopings that happen or the lift and shift decision that's made in a vacuum, do you think that there's something driving that? You think it's lack of knowledge? Do you think it's that there are, people are running like a tool one time and saying, well, like, let's run it on our environment. And this is what it's telling us. We should be in this cloud and here's how we should do it. Like, what's driving that? Because what always baffles me is I hear customers over and over and over. And if you're in this space long enough, you hear that's the problem with the cloud. You lift and shift, the costs get out of control, and then it's hard to manage them. So you think, well, that will never happen after a couple of years when you hear it every single time when that's the warning about the cloud, but it still does all the time. Why does it happen so often? Like, is it just easy to miss? Is it that people focus on more of the technology and they don't think about the process and the people?
Yeah, that's a great question. In my experience and in our experience working with customers, it's that from a culture and team perspective, there's the capability. Teams can do it. Teams can provision their own cloud resources, and engineering teams, in a lot of sense, particularly mature ones, they love that autonomy, and rightfully so. I mean, the cloud gives them that ability. They ought to take advantage. What's missing is the accountability. There's no performance KPI. There's no right sizing score. There's no showback or chargeback relative to the spend impact of their decision. There's nothing that comes back to them that says, yeah, you were able to push that button, but here's what it did. Here's the impact, and here's what it means for you. And in the case of chargebacks, organizations are trying to put in place real chargebacks back to the product team's P&L for how they consume cloud resources. Because in a sense, it generally speaking, it's not the best idea to then try to centrally control all of the cloud spend and try to recreate a procurement bottleneck that often existed in the traditional IT spend. So if teams are going to continue to be distributed, autonomous, doing the thing, procuring the resources that they need, provisioning the resources they need to build their apps as quickly as they need to, don't get in the way of that, but create a mechanism for them to be accountable for it. And obviously that accountability and that transparency with other teams drives the kind of behavior where all of a sudden it's not an unintentional abuse of the availability of that resource. It's a more intentional stewardship over what they're doing for the business. And that's what we try to do and what we have done working with customers, trying to increase that awareness and close the gap between capability. Yes, you can do it, but accountability. What does it mean for the business?
When you deliver your consulting and whatever that package may look like, if there's an output or, I imagine there's some sort of analysis that you guys would do, who in the organization is usually the champion for really promoting a FinOps culture, especially for the cloud? Is it usually coming from the financial viewpoint, or do you see it a lot of times coming from within IT? They just don't know how to sell it, or they don't know how to champion it, if you will.
Yeah, our champions have come from the technologists. I use that term generally. So sometimes it's the CTO, CIO, if those are different functions. We have clients, but those are two different roles depending on what they're doing. Even CDOs, digital officers that understand that they're responsible for that. They may run the IT groups that support the design and engineering teams. One of the things that I think will happen more, and this is coming from some of the data that's coming through the FinOps Foundation. They do the State of FinOps report every year. And in the 2022 findings, the percentage of practitioners that took the survey that identified themselves as coming from a financial or back office function was less than 10% combined across all those types, and including procurement. And we would like to see that increase, because I think that the cloud FinOps focus has done great things for technologists who already understand the cloud, already understand the nature of the services, and to some degree, they understand the pricing models. But the finance team is really just on the other end of this, like a fire hose, trying to ingest all these different changes in a completely different cost model. So when we conduct assessments, for example, and we do stakeholder interviews, we absolutely have a concerted effort to bring in financial leaders. So it's usually there's a role within a lot of organizations. We work with a digital controller. So this is a person who is essentially a controller in all the functions that you would associate a financial controller for. But they're focused on the expenses for digital projects, product development, and software development. So we had one customer where our main sponsor was a CIO, but ultimately who they delegated to help us navigate the environment, help us do our discovery, help us do our interviews, and to gather our information was a digital controller, which was actually very helpful because she could help navigate both the tech side, the business side. There was a procurement function who definitely felt like they needed a role in this new dynamic, and we certainly didn't want to alienate that group. But yeah, I think it's interesting as a result of this type of emerging discipline, our champions' roles are also changing. And it's kind of exciting to see, a digital controller. That wasn't a role I was working with from the client side 2 years ago.
That's awesome. You are talking about enterprises when you talk about digital officers and CTOs and CIOs. I assume you're working a lot with enterprises. I guess we do have some listeners that are smaller companies, mid-market size companies who may not have all those roles, who may not have the ability to have like a full FinOps group. So for a smaller company, mid-market, lean IT staff, maybe who doesn't have the cloud capabilities, how do they do FinOps without, having all of this expertise? And how do they train their folks to really to use the cloud to the best way possible, but not overspend?
Yeah. I think, dipping your toe is always a good measure. One of the things that we advise clients on is not to get caught up in the allure of transformation. I have to completely reinvent our culture and our operations and everything, et cetera, in some arbitrary time frame. What we always say is take incremental steps, right? A lot of times there is no ROI for building a FinOps team if your spend is at a certain level. Let's say that spend is less than $5 million a year. The waste associated with that spend, which if it's on par with industry average, it's probably 30%. And so, a FinOps team could grossly exceed what you're already overspending. So I think coming up with champions who want to learn more about that discipline and can do it part-time. And then as the need develops, as your spend increases, you move more workloads and applications into the cloud, you become more dependent on those services. you may have the justification for having full-time roles. But I think for smaller organizations, relatively, having a part-time focus across different types of roles, I think, business and data analysts, product owners, and of course, CTOs and CIOs, but even just, VPs of product, VP of IT, those roles can really get behind that kind of effort, because we really do see, again, relative to your comment about mid-sized companies, it's a grassroots movement in terms of the internal need. I think in that, going back to the FinOps survey, only 46% of the we need to focus on FinOps comes from a C-level directive. Now, we expect that that's going to increase significantly in the years to come as it becomes more of a budget item. Hey, we got to invest to address this problem because it's leading to overspend. But, roughly 44% of that came from people lifting their heads saying, this is a problem. I want to spend more time looking at our cloud bill. I want to dig into the data to find out what's going on, where these anomalies are coming from, why we're overspending. And so curiosity really, really helps too. So, but I think, going back to where in smaller companies does this come from? I'd like to see it come from analysts and product leads that are looking at this saying, I'm in charge of the P&L of this product, and I'm consuming this service. I'm probably doing my organization a disservice by not paying attention to the kind of the cause and effect of what we're doing with cloud spend.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that there's a lot of things that people can do. One of the things that we see a lot is the adoption of the cloud for a small organization or a mid-size organization. They're not even to the FinOps conversation. They're trying to figure out, do we have the personnel that understand the cloud, that are interested in doing it? Are they, do you have people in the organization who are afraid of change? And I think depending on where you're at and the type of companies you're working with, that's a real conversation too. And so it's getting them to understand, hey, FinOps is probably down the road, but it can be started basically when you go to the cloud. And when you do that and you put that mindset when you're going to the cloud, you will be better off down the road because you have a practice for managing cloud spend, which is one of the, I would say top 3 problems that people would cite if they're going to the cloud. So I think we agree with that. For kind of to wrap up, and not immediately, but I have a couple questions for you future looking, because we've been talking about a lot about FinOps now. So general question about the cloud. So we've got really right now with the hyperscalers, you've got Google, who's a distant third, and then you got Azure and AWS for Microsoft Azure, GCP for Google, and then you've got AWS for Amazon. Those are sort of the 3. I know you've got Oracle, you've got, I think, Alibaba's sometimes in the mix. You've got some others, but make a prediction. What do you think is going to happen do you think there's going to be more competition in 5 years? And where will that come from? Or do you think that these 3 behemoths will just continue to take off? And when we talk about cloud in 5 to 10 years, we're still going to be talking about the same 3 players.
Yeah, I think where you'll see more players coming in is in hybrid cloud solutions. I mean, you're already seeing that even with larger companies. IBM and Oracle spend a lot of time in hybrid cloud, but in terms of companies that have a public cloud first strategy, that's the level of service, that the type of performance they're looking for. Those 3 organizations are really in such a position to, just from a level of investment perspective, to really give those organizations best of breed. I don't think you're going to see things like all of a sudden GCP overtakes AWS and Azure starts to eat major chunks of AWS market share. What I do think you'll see, and this is just me personally looking at data, talking to customers, and we're finding out that more customers are adopting a multi-cloud strategy across public providers. In even just a couple of years ago, the main mindset was almost a default of, well, most of our stuff is in Azure, therefore we're going to use Azure going forward. And the problem with that is no one provider can cover every single use case you're going to need as a customer from a cloud service perspective. So we still advocate for a 1-for-1, resource or cloud provider to application ratio, but application A could be in Azure, application B could be in AWS, and you could leverage the different providers. And that's good from an innovation perspective. What that will also do is grossly complicate your ability to manage costs across different providers. So the other piece of innovation that we will certainly see in the FinOps realm develop is a whole slew of providers that are creating third-party tools that can help you aggregate all of this information coming from your different public providers and help you assess your usage patterns from Azure, from AWS, from GCP, and what does that mean for your overall spend, and how is it going to help you make decisions towards your spend goals. So I don't think you're going to see major changes in market share relative to who's first, second, third. But what I do think you'll see is a larger focus on multi-cloud strategy across the public providers.
What do you think would slow down the adoption of cloud at the rate we're going right now, if there is anything?
Yeah, well, I mentioned it earlier. I think organizations are already doing this. They're moving, and then they either move too much, too fast, too soon, and they did not give themselves the right ROI horizon. And then they can't save face to their constituency. They can't go to their board. They can't go to their customers. They can't go to their leadership and say, this investment was worth it. They're forced from a dollars and cents perspective to go back to on-prem. So I think there is definitely a need to make sure you have the right candidate to move to the cloud, and make sure that cost management is part of your migration plan, not something that you focus once your workload has been transitioned, once your application has been moved. It's not too late at that point, but it's certainly more expensive to fix it.
Yeah. It's like your personal budgeting in your household, or it's like personal spending. You don't just look at it once a year and say, oh, whoa, we spent way too much on so-and-so. You look at it every month. You look at it every couple of weeks. That's generally who manages their money the best, is those who know kind of what they're spending and when they're spending and how they're spending and planning for spending. It's no different for a large company with the cloud. It's look at it all the time, have a way to assess, have a way to understand when there's peaks and valleys.
Yeah.
And the more you can do that and get ahead of it, the better you will be at managing your cost.
And Aaron, I'll say quickly to that point, one comment to that is, one of the things that we see with our clients, for example, is when we do the stakeholder interviews and we talk to the finance team, what they're used to is a purchasing cycle where you might purchase gear for 2 years, but you're purchasing for anticipated growth, and you make that purchase up front. You don't do that in the cloud. You don't have to. You purchase for what you need then, because when you do get to the point where you need more, you need to horizontally scale, vertically scale, whichever the case, you can do it in real time. So don't get caught up in trying to purchase for 3 years like you did traditionally. Even that simple dynamic of how it worked in CapEx and how it works in this OpEx model, it's totally different. And companies that don't pay attention to that wonder why they spent too much. And they did. They bought too much of the cloud.
We get the question sometimes, can you CapEx cloud? Do you think there will ever be a way to CapEx cloud spend? What do you think about that comment, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, well, companies do that now. I think sometimes when that comment's made, it's in the context of when you purchase a commitment, and it doesn't really matter what the vehicle is. It could be a reservation instance, could be a savings plan, could be a sustained usage. But when you're making that commitment, there's a weighted average cost of capital calculation that a lot of organizations make, because that prepayment, depending on how many instances or services you're running concurrently, could be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so you're weighing that investment versus some of the other CapEx investments that the company might make. And once you get past that, you then make that purchase and amortize it over the term that you purchased it for. So there, a lot of times they consider those commitment-based purchases to be capital expenditures, even though the on-demand consumption of that resource would be an OpEx type of model. So we're already seeing that today, and a lot of companies do that. They treat that commitment like a project, which is actually a good strategy, because it takes you through the break even and takes you through the weighted average cost of capital calculation too.
Do you see, I guess, and I hate to go back to this, but you mentioned this and you kind of brought up something that I've heard a couple of times recently. Customers, your traditional providers, when you think of traditional infrastructure, they always, Microsoft is a perfect example with your email licensing in O365, M365. You would sign an EA and you'd commit to levels of spend, blah, blah, blah. I've heard more recently companies, enterprises a lot of times, who are who are in a battle with certain, okay, do we go Azure? Do we go GCP? They're probably not looking at the multi-cloud as much as they should be, but let's just say that they're getting a sweet deal, air quotes on that, like from one of the cloud providers to say, hey, commit to this level of spend. Do you think that those are good things for companies? Or because I look at it and say, if you commit to a level of spend, you're basically forcing yourself to get to some level that you might not need to. And so you're finding any way to do it. I could see why you'd think it'd be good because, hey, we got to get there one way or another, so let's just commit. But I also see that it could prevent people from really embracing FinOps to say, are we spending the right amount of money? Or, okay, we spent our money, we spent our commitment, that's great, we're there. Like, it doesn't incentivize you to optimize. And that's my big problem with it. I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, well, in the case of Microsoft, for example, there's the agreement, which depending on what kind of agreement you sign, it's really entitlement, right? What type of discounts or what type of access to consume services across the board do you have? And then within that, you can still make targeted commitment purchases based on what you need. And so there's different use cases for whether or not you would do that. So you could have an enterprise agreement that is based on some overall consumption model, and you would put your highest volume, most sustained, least likely to change, most dependable workloads. You can put those through a 1-year commitment, let's say, or even a 3-year, again, depending on what the workload's doing. But for your product development and for your R&D and things that need to change on a dime, that's risky. And so you might not necessarily commit to those. You might work spot instances, for example. You might try to work those into your plan. Those actually carry deeper discounts than reservations themselves. And if you use them appropriately, you can achieve bigger discounts for applications you're developing where your resource needs could change significantly. Your usage patterns do this, they spike up and down. They're not very consistent. So again, it comes back to use case, but I think it's always the right combination. I don't think the providers have set customers up to get trapped in is an enterprise agreement or not? It's a commitment or not? I think those are good in certain cases. I think where you need flexibility, they might not be as good. Could be riskier and more expensive in the long run to commit to something now. There's other avenues to get to that saving.
Yeah, and I don't mean to say they're always bad. I just see in certain situations where it's like you said, multi-cloud, which I agree that you need to really consider a multi-cloud approach. I just think that I see it in the light of there's too much being put into one just because of a number that was put out. And I think it's lack of understanding of what you should and could be doing. So I definitely agree with you. And I think there's always, a use case and there's always a scenario that does work and doesn't work. For the listeners, and this is kind of how we always close our episode. Will, by the way, this has been a super insightful show. I think a lot of folks will learn a lot from this. Really appreciate you sharing. You're giving a State of the Union, the Will Friedrich State of the Union, in front of 10 million people, however many people you want to give, a lot of people. And you get to give one piece of advice. It could be general IT, general cloud, specifically about cloud FinOps in general. What advice do you give to people?
That is a good question. Aaron, I'll think of it like this. I'll think that I'm imagining myself speaking to, let's say, 10 million young people early in career, first or second year. And this is something that I help with, coaching our teams, help coaching staff, whatever the case, and even something that I pay attention to as I'm doing it. Borrowing from, there's a book by Dr. Jordan Peterson. It's called 12 Rules for Life. And it's really an anecdote to empower you as an individual to help you be more valuable to yourself, your community, your organizations. And one of the rules is be precise in your speech. And when I read that and I read the chapter corresponding to that rule, it really, really hit home with me. And you see that a lot in professional and personal life. And I think it comes down to not spending too much time making generalist claims about whatever it is that you're talking about, whether you're talking to a customer, whether you're talking to a partner, whether you're talking to whatever it is in a professional sense. So I would say I always try to encourage people to, at a certain point, that claim should be backed by a piece of data. And then that data point is used to substantiate that claim. And then coming up with, putting that data point in context. So going back to the comment I made about compound annual growth rate between cloud spend and traditional IT spend, I think a lot of people could go out there and make the claim that the cloud is great and it's growing and all these types of things, but look at the numbers and then what do the numbers suggest, right? And you could even go out and say something like, well, cloud is growing in the US across 2 segments by 15% a year. Well, what does that mean? Compared to what? And so when you look at that compared to traditional spend, it's like, wow, 15% is a lot more than 1.3%. Those 2 growth trajectories are not even on the same plane. That's just kind of a silly example in the context of this conversation, but it really goes back to, being precise in your speech and being able to use data and information to back up your claims. I think it really helps conversations and really gets at the heart of what you're trying to say. So that would be my tidbit for young professionals, I would say.
We appreciate you sharing that. Will, we appreciate you joining the show today. Thank you for sharing all of the information that you have. Will, how can people get in touch with you if they want to reach out?
Yeah, absolutely. You can reach me through LinkedIn. That's probably my preferred social media outlet. Or you could reach me through email, william.friedrich@experis.com. And yeah, would love to chat FinOps and to chat cloud and services. I'm a community member of the FinOps Foundation, so you can find me on their Slack channel. So all of those are great.
Well, thanks for joining, Will. We will put the information in the show notes. Super insightful. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. Thanks for listening, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the day.
Thanks for listening. The IT Matters podcast is produced by Upcalla, an IT advisory firm that helps businesses navigate the vast and complex IT marketplace. Learn more about Upcalla at opkalla.com.